Hello, welcome to Slimehouse, a podcast rated PG for crude humor, outrageous hijinks, and mild language. I'm Max.
I'm Jasper.
I'm Jared.
And I'm Nelson. And today we're mixing up our format from our usual episodes where we just focus on one movie. We're going to do something a little different that has come from conversations we've had because we've realized that not everybody knows what Slimehouse is. And rather than just looking at one film, maybe if we did a case study where we compared two different films, one that leans Slimehouse and one that does not, as a way to more thoroughly distinguish what is and what isn't in the genre of Slimehouse. So we're going to call this a slime study and further explain why not every kids and family movie, not every silly comedy is Slimehouse.
So for our first official episode-length slime study, we've chosen a pair of animal movies, specifically horse movies, that were released in close proximity and that both closely adhere to the classic narrative and thematic structures of horse films, sports films, underdog films, and most importantly, family films. So for this study, we'll be looking at Racing Stripes and Dreamer, both released in the year 2005. And released in the fall, Dreamer tells the true story of a young girl who convinces her father to rehabilitate a filly horse to race in the Breeders' Cup.
Is Mr. Kale Crane here?
I'm Kale Crane.
Why don't you stand up? She's getting faster and faster.
You saying she should race?
It's a long shot, but why not us?
You ever seen a kid so happy with a horse?
Yeah, I have.
But released prior in January of 2005, Racing Stripes follows the fictional story of a zebra who dreams of being a racehorse and the young girl who convinces her father that she can make the zebra a champion.
Well, subdivide me and Kentucky fry me.
To me, you're just a horse with stripes who needs an attitude adjustment.
Don't make me chew open a can of pony whoop.
If that's a racehorse, then I'm D-O-double-G, baby.
Well, unfortunately, I don't race nobodies.
Figures. All talk and no action.
All right, partner, step back and watch me work.
Now what?
Now you give it all you got.
So for a little bit more context on the release, beyond it being 2005 for both of these films, that was a year where Slimehouse was starting to be past its peak in the mainstream perhaps, but also just be a little bit more high variance in terms of the kinds of family films that were out there. This is sort of a transition from the Slimehouse brand of family films to the franchise era of family films, as the Harry Potter movies became a little bit more mature at this time with Goblet of Fire. You had Chronicles of Narnia this same year, which was a huge hit. Slimehouse was at a crossroads.
And it's also an era where movies didn't have to be tentpoles. These movies were just standalone stories that were contained within the entire 2 hour or less runtime and not trying to spawn a theme park or a franchise.
To start, I think it would be good to kind of look at the marketing side of Slimehouse, because this is something that is the most outward-facing thing you can define about the genre, and I think it's the thing that a lot of people think of when they think of what is Slimehouse. And I think Racing Stripes, in comparison to Dreamer, really, really highlights those differences. And first of all, you can look at the poster, just that raw image of two horse movies that are extremely narratively similar, as we pointed out, but are just very different in their tone. You look at Dreamer, which is very clean and focused on the actors. Dakota Fanning and Kurt Russell are the headliners in this. It's very dramatic. There's a lot of natural golden light in the imagery. And then, of course, very, very prominently on the poster, inspired by a true story. And that is a key selling point, that it is inspired by a true story, and that's an inspirational movie. On the flip side, Racing Stripes is very focused on the animals. You have the zebra and the flies that appear in this movie that are the zebra's friends, very at the forefront. You have these bright kind of comic strip like colors, these blues, reds, and yellows. and these kind of comic strip like fonts too that you might find. There's a very punny tagline.
Cheer till you're hoarse.
And then another kind of funny tidbit that actually occurs a lot in the franchise era now. There's a whole series of character posters for each of the animal characters. And you see that now with like Marvel and things like that. You know, Iron Man has his own Avengers poster. But this one's particularly funny because you have the lazy dog voiced by Snoop Dogg getting its own poster, even though he has maybe 4 lines in the movie.
It's a very typecast role.
Yeah, so something else that I feel like is notable about these character posters, they depict the characters in positions and doing things that they never do in the movie. The Snoop Dogg dog in his poster has on like sunglasses and a gold chain necklace, which he doesn't wear clothes at all in this movie, so that makes it clear they're really trying to write off the fact they have a rapper playing the dog, which I think this celebrity stunt casting is something we got talked about with Doolittle. And I feel like this movie is really a key example of when I think about that, and this posters really emphasize that because they have the celebrity's name front and center, and for the most part, the animals are designed to look in some way how images we associate with the real-life actors. Although, strangely, the horse played by Dustin Hoffman is wearing a strange hat in this one, which is not something...
Well, they also give them all, like, zebra merch.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the celebrity casting because it has kind of a twofold approach. The first is it's appealing to the grown-ups who are going to get dragged to this movie if they say, oh, you know, Whoopi Goldberg, she's great. I'll go see a movie where she's the GOAT. And also for kids who don't know who those actors are, that there's something that I'm going to coin as the Jar Jar effect, which is where characters are supporting roles that have very little to do with the plot, but their goal is just to be huge parts of the marketing for kids. And the flies in this movie who are introduced pretty late into it, like about an hour in, as soon as they come in, every scene they're in is just trailer package ready for marketing for how fun this movie is going to be because it has talking flies who are silly.
Yeah, I specifically remember there's a scene in which the flies like rap along to, they rap a lot in the movie, but they rap along to and breakdance to Walk This Way. And I remember that being very front and center in the marketing, and like kids on the playground and stuff would be rapping Walk This Way. Clearly, like I don't think they were listening to Run DMC and Aerosmith. It was all from the marketing for this movie.
Which is very similar to what we talked about a couple weeks ago with Snow Dogs, and Max brought up Kangaroo Jack, which we haven't covered, where this Jar Jar effect, as you call it, Nelson, puts these kind of kooky CGI characters, CGI creatures, and you go to watch the movie and they're minimal in their support.
It's like, without those two characters, Buzz and Scuzz as they're called, voiced by Steve Harvey and David Spade, I feel like this movie does lose its slime factor, though, if you took them out of the movie. I feel like they're there to slime it up.
Give me a beat! On a freestyle, I said an old MacDonald had a farm. E-I-E-I-O.
Oh, wait.
And on that farm, he had a zebra.
Oh, what? A zebra?
A zebra. But he wants to be a racer.
Oh, Lord.
And I also want to talk about the DVD cover, because I rented this last week to watch it. The DVD menu for this movie is basically one of the worst things I've ever seen. It's basically, the main menu is the two fly characters just like hopping around. Stripes, the main zebra character voiced by Frankie Muniz, they're just like hopping around his butt, and then the zebra's tail keeps on trying to swat them. And it's just like, it reminds me of a computer game I played as a kid called Alpha Bunk Farm. This is kind of a deep cut, but it reminded me a lot of that, but that was better.
I think what's with it, it's funny that we're immediately jumping into these flies, but I think what's with it is that it's the type of thing that could have been retroactively added to the plot to, like you said, slime it up. Because it's important to mention that Dreamer and Racing Stripes, like in first draft of scripts, could be the same movie. They follow such similar underdog horse movie conventions. And I think that's why this is it's a great place to start, because on paper they're so similar, but all of the choices from that point forward go left and right, and the flies are kind of like the furthest left that Slimehouse can go.
Yeah, I think there's two interesting characters to look at. There's both the flies, who very much don't really have any bearing on the actual narrative of the movie. They're there just for humor clearly for kids to find funny. You can tell it's very juvenile humor. But then there's also a pelican played by the actor Joe Pantoliano, Joey Pants as he's more commonly known. He's just sort of a gangster movie character actor, but he's probably most famous for playing the character of Ralph in The Sopranos, which at the time this movie came out was still on TV and sort of at the height of its popularity. They have him voicing a pelican that is just sort of a very like a mobster stereotype, and that very much feels like a shoehorned in character sort of to keep the jokes for the adults. Just having an actor from a popular adult-centered show playing a character similar to the one he played in the show, it feels like that's shoved in for the humor for the adults, and the flies are kind of shoved in for the humor for the kids. And I think humor for the adults that isn't really adult humor, it's just what whoever made the movie thinks will make the movie appeal to adults, is something I think is very slimy.
I have to say, Jared always brought up this kind of mobster in Slimehouse thing, and I was only about 50% sold on it. I'm now 100% sold that was a thing of like, let's add the mobster cliches into the kids' movies via Slimehouse, because the whole thing are jokes about like tongue-in-cheek references to gangster antics through the eyes of a pelican from the Bronx, I think. That's a very Slimehouse thing that now I think we can hang our hat on.
So, like, I think what we're getting at here is that the use of animals is it's very much in common with Snow Dogs, which we recently covered, and then other kind of Slimehouse movies we'll talk about later, I'm sure. And Dreamer, by contrast, doesn't really have anything to compare that with. There's Dreamer the horse itself, but there's no other, like, prominent animal characters in the movie. And it would be, even if they like didn't talk, that I think the colorful cast of animal characters that really can drive up the slime factor in a movie like this, in movies like this, I should say.
Yeah, and Dreamer is focused on the humans, with the horse serving more as kind of the plot device. Racing Stripes is all about the animals, where like the humans are almost serving as the plot device.
And having talking animals is something that doesn't happen in the real world, at least as far as we know. And both movies, again, following the template, both movies have this curmudgeon-y father who's reluctant to be involved in horse racing, and an eager beaver daughter who's like, Daddy, please, let's do it. And the dynamics there are almost written the exact same way. But with Racing Stripes, that's only 50% of the equation. There's the whole other talking animal thing, which we were talking about just before this. And you have a character of Stripes who is actually a protagonist. The zebra in this film has his own journey where he has to kind of become the racehorse, and he talks through it, and he's got the friends and family around him supporting him, and he's got an antagonist in the form of other racehorses, and he becomes a fully fleshed out character. Whereas Dreamer, the titular horse in the other film, is never a character. It's almost like a vehicle, literally, that everyone is surrounding by. But there's never an expectation that Dreamer itself is going to have an arc and inner turmoil and conflict. And that reality check of having a character like Stripes, who's kind of in the vein of like Babe or other classic animal movies where that's a character, versus a movie like Dreamer, which doesn't anthropomorphize its horse character.
Even like in the way the family conflicts are portrayed in these two movies, I think is very different, because in Dreamer it's, there's Dakota Fanning and her conflict with her dad, played by Kurt Russell. Then also there's a mother character in there named Elizabeth Shue, who's kind of like mediate between the two. And I feel like the family dynamics in that movie are actually believable and real. Whereas in Racing Stripes, I think we've maybe proposed this as a Slimehouse thematic trope, but the mother character is, it's implied that she passed away. And so it's just the kid, played by Hayden Panettiere, her relationship with her father, played by Bruce Greenwood. I guess Emmett Walsh shows up later on to maybe, be that mediator. But I do feel like that played hard into the idea of like, kids not being listened to and they're going against it.
Well, what Dreamer I think does is it gives the dad his own conflicts and his own story and his own, supporting cast, that he has his own conflicts with. His father, played by Chris Christopherson, his opponent, played by David Morse. He has his own kind of bubble of tension with other people, whereas in Racing Stripes, Bruce Greenwood really only has tension with his daughter, which is kind of alleviated halfway through the movie, and the very one-dimensional villain played by Wendy Malick, who owns the horse track that Racing Stripes eventually races at. So allowing Kurt Russell's character to be more fleshed out and have himself a greater dynamic in his own narrative, I think is kind of echoes that. Racing Stripes is just very two-dimensional.
Would you say Racing Stripes is very black and white?
Ah, yes. Or white and black.
Actually, I want to talk more about the villain characters you mentioned, Wendy Malick's character and David Morse's character in Dreamer. Just the costume design of those two characters also really sets these movies' slime factors apart, because David Morse's character is like, he's always wearing this formal suit and all that. It's kind of a corporate slime bag, and I feel like that's a character you would get in a PG-13 drama. Whereas I feel like the way Wendy Malick is, like, her costumes are very extravagant, and like she's really playing up like like a southern accent. She's very cartoony, not quite Cruella de Vil or whatever, but hammy. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like a major way that I sort of was comparing these two movies as I watched them was seeing like where Dreamer had the chance to swing for Slimehouse and didn't really take that chance, and Racing Stripes did. And I think the villains are a great example of that, like you said, Jared. I think that Racing Stripes really went for the villain because they're very much similar characters. Just the rich character that's the best always has the best horses, and then the scrappy underdog challenging them. But the villains in Dreamer are much more realistic and just depicted as sort of assholes, and then like the characters in Racing Stripes are very much depicted as way over the top.
He's running the big Colt Goliath boy in the classic.
That's right. Goliath Boy's a favorite. And when he wins a cup, it'll be my 5th horse of the year.
Do you think Goliath boy remembers what Sony's butt looks like?
Why?
Because it's all he's going to be seeing ever on race day.
Some other characters in both of the movies, I think, that are in Dreamer, the characters played by Luis Guzman and Freddie Rodriguez. I feel like in a Slimehouse movie, those sort of assistant character roles, especially because Luis Guzman at this time especially was doing more comedy than drama. I feel like in the Slimehouse movies, those would be kind of the comic relief. But in Dreamer, they really weren't at all. They were supporting characters, but they didn't really have any comedy in the movie. That's a key example kind of when the movie could have put some slime in there, and it really didn't. And I think that really shows you what Dreamer is aiming for versus what Racing Stripes is.
I definitely felt like those two characters are the closest the movie got to slime. I did feel like they were kind of like had a snark to them at points. With Freddie Rodriguez, he's like the guy who's going to be racing on Dreamer. There's a lot of humor about him being so wildly unprepared, and I think Luis Guzman is like a super slimy actor at this point in his career. I agree, Max. That's the closest it gets between Racing Stripes and Dreamer in terms of like this particular aspect of the film.
Well, kind of to echo both of your points, the Luis Guzman and Freddie Rodriguez characters, are kind of the jockey and the trainer's assistant, so to speak. In Racing Stripes, those are played by actual animals. Dustin Hoffman is the horse trainer. Whoopi Goldberg is also there on the side. The flies also help him out during the race. So you have these trainer tropes, so to speak, played by animals, talking animals at that. I love your point, Max, that Dreamer could have, said, oh, let's actually make the goat next door his trainer, but actually no, because this is inspired by a true story.
I know enough that horses do have like a horse that like rides with them and often builds their confidence, and so they could have even done that with the true story. But there's another part of that Freddie Rodriguez character. Yes, he has some comedy, and there's a whole bit about like him losing enough weight and all that because he's a jockey, so he's got to be fit for the thing. But he also has these sincere moments, and like sincerity throughout the Dreamer movie is like the main selling point more than the comedy. It's about he's got his problem where he doesn't believe in himself, and he had a serious accident that really hurt him, and so he's like dealing with human dimensional problems that are also very family friendly, mind you, but are stuff that has a little more depth to it, whereas Racing Stripes is more surface.
And that's really key, Nelson. I think that word sincerity is really rings true. Racing Stripes has, sincerity to it. I really think there is a heart in that movie, but it's such a jokester of a movie, whereas Dreamer is so pure in its spirit. How that sincerity is communicated in both movies is really what kind of sets it apart thematically, I think.
Yeah, I think one specific example I kind of put down in my notes in that regard is something we talk about a lot with Slimehouse is sort of the scatological or like butt-related humor. And Dreamer actually has one line where Dakota Fanning says something in the effect of like, she asks the man that owns the rival horse, like, does your horse remember what like Dreamer's butt looks like? And he's like, why? And she's like, because that's what he's going to be seeing in the race. And I feel like that is the closest thing this movie comes to a sort of scatological joke, but the humor in Dreamer is very much just like gentle, sort of cute humor. It's just sort of based around like a child saying something cute and you kind of chuckle and smile and that's it. But Racing Stripes, the humor in general, way more in your face. There's multiple like shit jokes in it that are pretty disgusting at some points. There's a part where the pelican that we talked about earlier like poops on the rooster's face. That's really gross. And then there's just a lot of like fart humor with the flies, and the flies rap about eating duty at one point, just like just full of humor like that. While Dreamer has one like quiet butt joke that just sort of goes unmentioned, and I think that really shows you the key difference is just Dreamer is really not trying to be funny at all. There's a couple of little laughs on the way, but it is a drama first and foremost, while Racing Stripes very much, even if it has the same sort of underdog inspirational story, very much going for comedy.
Oh, you weren't supposed to hear that.
Oh, God, what is that? I got 1,000,000 eyes and you got every one of them burning.
As we've been watching Slimehouse movies, it's been easy to get in kind of a checklist mentality of like, oh, it's got a butt joke. Check, it's a Slimehouse movie. Oh, it's got the overworked single parent who's kind of a goofball. Check, Slimehouse components. Check, check, check. And what I realized watching Dreamer is there's a moment where Dakota Fanning is trying to prove herself as committed, and she gets up crack of dawn, makes herself some coffee like grown-ups do, and it's gross. And it's funny because we've just seen, this is our third movie we've watched where there's a coffee is gross joke. So that moment could fit snugly into Slimehouse. But the tone of it is much more earnest, and so it almost doesn't matter what happens. Like you said, there's a kind of butt comment too later that kind of has some parallels to Slimehouse, but it's almost irrelevant because the tone of it is not going for Slimehouse at all. And I'm realizing more and more that, like, yes, non-Slimehouse movies can have Slimehouse moments, but the tone and that ephemeral vibe that we've talked about before is the first and foremost thing that we should be looking for.
The score in Dreamer is it's a little almost like melancholic, because I think the first hour of the movie is honestly kind of a downer. This horse is almost like killed at the hands of the David Morse character. It gets uplifting later on, but I think sort of like settles in this tone of kind of like this kind of middle America, blue collar, heartland kind of vibe. I mean, Racing Stripes, the opening scene was actually kind of surprising to me, because it wasn't like, oh, we're starting in Slime Land, because it's like this black and white. But it basically echoes the opening of Babe, where the pig character is separated from his mother. It starts in this way that maybe also could have gone a less slimy direction, but once Stripes is brought into the family, I think you see, both in the score and sort of the color of the film, and also just like the visual effects that they do put in there, in particular the flies. I feel like the visual effects on them look very amateur to me, but that makes it more slimy to me. And I've amped on this before, where like that kind of like late 90s, early 2000s mash of live action and like early CGI. There's something uniquely slimy about that, even though I feel like this is a little bit later than that. And
I like that you brought up that opening scene, Jared, in Racing Stripes, and how it's, very dimly lit, almost black and white. And Dreamer itself, also has kind of a muted palette itself, the entire movie. It almost feels like the entire movie's kind of shot at golden hour or dusk or really early morning. So it has this very earthiness to it, which, again, that opening scene of Racing Stripes, near black and white, very desaturated, but again, very dimly lit, cooler color palette. But then the kind of, once we have that establishing scene in Racing Stripes, if you played these side by side, you might think, oh, like these are kind of going the same direction. Then Racing Stripes pivots into this very colorful, very vibrant, just look at the way the two different farms look, very saturated kind of bright greens versus these very kind of natural pastoral greens in Dreamer. And if you take a look at the two farms too in these movies, I think that's extremely indicative of where their heads are at. The farm in Dreamer, both movies are also set in Kentucky, Max's home territory. The farm in Dreamer is very idyllic, very dreamlike, very clean, put together. Yes, it's fallen on a little bit of hard times, but it's still, you know, it feels like it's well kept. Cut over to Racing Stripes, they make every effort they can to make this farm look run down and just gross and stinky, making a farm really like look like you kind of imagine a farm to smell is very, very slimy to me.
At one point, the Pelican kind of jabs at it and calls it Old McDonald's farm, and it does look like the Old McDonald farm. It's bright red, and it's just, you know, a little more like a barnyard feeling, whereas in Dreamer there are no other animals, and it's very, very quiet, and yeah, it looks much more like a getaway than like a goofy, silly farm.
Dreamer is shot on location in Lexington, Kentucky, which is where it's set, while Racing Stripes is shot entirely in South Africa, which I think sort of goes to show that Dreamer's very much aiming for realism, because Kentucky's not a place where movies are filmed frequently at all. I don't think it has much, like, the weather's not particularly good, the tax credits for filming are not really, like, it's just not a place where people film things. So the fact that they chose to actually film it on location, I think, shows that they're going for a true story, as the title emphasizes, as the subtitle emphasizes. Racing Stripes, they filmed in South Africa. Most of it definitely looks like sets that were painted and built for the movie. They definitely sort of had a control of their own world in Racing Stripes and chose to make it more fantastical.
Yeah, one comparison I was going to make is kind of the setting in Dreamer really feels like historical landmark in a way, like you would feel if you were going on a, you know, tour or field trip of a farm or, you know, the old racetrack, whereas Racing Stripes looks and feels like it's like a theme park, like a fake farm. As you said, Max, created specifically like a commercial purpose as opposed for a actual working purpose.
Yeah, I think a pretty easy way to kind of pinpoint what these movies are going for is just looking at the opening credits, because Dreamer's opening credits, it's just sort of sweeping shots of these Kentucky farms. There's a very sort of just majestic sort of melancholy score by John Debney, who we've actually seen a few times on this podcast, who scored a lot of the movies we watched, including Snow Dogs, which Snow Dogs has a very slimy score. So this is a guy we know can go for slime. And the fact that he made a conscious decision here to not do so, I think really says a lot about it. But the opening credits in this, like I said, Dreamer's opening credits, just beautiful sweeping shots of these landscapes. And Racing Stripes' intro is just sort of this odd CGI sort of credits that sort of are superimposed over zebra skin with sort of a fast-paced soundtrack. Just having the openings compared really show you this movie is going to be, Racing Stripes is going to be a more fast-paced, sort of wacky movie, even though the opening hasn't been particularly wacky yet, while Dreamer is going to be a much more quiet, considered drama.
And this brings up a very important point about the movie's different approaches to reality. I think, interestingly, both movies have one thing hugely in common, which is they're both underdog stories, right? So they do all this stuff to set up that we've got this big horse race coming up, and these horses that we're supposed to cheer for have no chance. And in Dreamer, the reasons why it's an underdog are things such as it's got an injury that happened, an accident that was not good for the horse, broken leg. It's an older horse. It was supposed to be actually put down, but they protested and kept it alive. And it's really not meant to be a racehorse. Originally, they planned to use it as a breeding horse, but then it's infertile. So these are all real, plausible problems that could happen to a horse, and that when it races, make it an underdog because it has all these things stacked up against it. In Racing Stripes, what makes it an underdog? It's a zebra.
Yeah, exactly.
And zebras are not supposed to race. And that's number one, that's why they shot it in South Africa, so that presumably, I didn't work on it, but I'm guessing that it's so they could get more zebras involved, because I doubt there are that many zebras running around the plains of Kentucky. And so right away, there's just a plausibility factor that, the underdog setup in one movie is all things that could actually happen, and in the Slimehouse version, it's manufactured.
I think it just comes down to the very basic thing you learn when you first start looking at movies and studying them, which is formalism versus realism. And I think that single kind of principal component of how people make movies or feature films and tell their stories is a big explanation as to why Racing Stripes is the way it is as a slimier movie, and how Dreamer is the way it is as a more kind of a family drama that you could take the whole family to and not have a problem. But watching it, I was reminded of movies I watched for the last episode of last season, where it was the 2020 recap of Slimehouse, and we watched movies like Call of the Wild and a few others that I enjoyed, but they were not very high slime scores at all.
Yeah, I think something about Racing Stripes too is when you really break it down, I know we've kind of touched on this a little, it very easily could not be a very slimy movie, even if it did have the talking animals, because there's the characters that we've mentioned, the pelicans, and very much especially the flies, that add the sliminess. But if you take them out of it, you pretty much just have Babe, very similar to Babe, both aesthetically and plot-wise, which I don't think Babe is a particularly slimy movie. I think it's more just a storybook type, maybe a type movie that's just sort of trying to have a old-fashioned children's movie kind of feel. But the flies, who are constantly rapping, making poop jokes, and then this gangster pelican that's just kind of thrown in. I think making the decision to add these characters whose purposes are solely comic is really what takes it over the top and makes it a Slimehouse movie.
And I also think, to add on to that, their sense of humor being very rooted in contemporary pop culture is very slimy. You can have a fly who makes fart jokes. That's inherently very Slimehouse. But when you have those flies doing a parody of Who Let the Dogs Out, replacing dogs with zebra, then, you've got yourself a bona fide Slimehouse movie.
What are you doing? Look, you're a horse. You all have long faces, get it?
You think you had it rough? You try starting out life as a maggot. Nobody wants to pet a little maggot. Nobody.
Scuzz, come on now. Easy.
One thing I'll say about Racing Stripes that I don't think we've talked about yet is there's one character that is very his presence in the movie is surreal to me, and kind of reminds me of actually the character of Artie in Pete and Pete, but it's the mailman character, where the way he's introduced, he's basically dressed like a 2010s hipster, even though this is 2005, and he's introduced with the Sergio Leone Good and Bad and the Ugly theme. But towards the end, you see him at the beginning of the movie, Racing Stripes. Then you see him again at the end of the movie, and he's got Stripes face paint on, black and white and zebra.
He's his biggest fan.
I think another key difference between another really integral thing that takes these movies apart is there's a scene in Racing Stripes and a scene in Dreamer that both involve a horse being injured. In Dreamer, it's pretty much a key conflict whether or not to put this horse down that was injured. It's treated with very seriously. And in Racing Stripes, there's a scene in which the zebra runs headfirst into a tree when he's racing the mailman. And that's a complete slapstick scene. He just kind of makes a goofy face that they do with weird CGI, and he gets back up. And I think that really shows you that realism versus heightened sort of slapstick of these two movies.
It's a great point, because that could kill a horse, and yet it's treated as just kind of oh, he's a klutz.
Yeah, it's not, it has no effect on it, but that is something that, in a movie like Dreamer, that would be like career ending.
Before we wrap up, Max, rarely do we cover not one but two movies set in Kentucky.
Yeah,
So
and specifically Lexington, Kentucky, as well, which is where I live. At least that's where Dreamer said. I think it's pretty vague in Racing Stripes, which, honestly, yeah, like, I recognized most of the locations from Dreamer. I'm not someone who's into horse racing at all, but I've been on, like, field trips to a lot of the major race tracks, and Keeneland, where the Breeders' Cup is held, is probably, like, the biggest racetrack in Lexington, and that might have been where the Breeders' Cup has been held there. I'm not sure if it's actually where it was held in the true story, and it's a movie that shows really, it makes Kentucky look really pretty. Dreamer does, and Racing Stripes, for a movie that's not filmed here, it looked more like Kentucky than I would have expected. I remember actually when Dreamer was filming in Lexington. I was very young, but one of my cousin's friends is actually an extra in one of the classroom scenes. I don't know if he actually appears on camera. I don't believe so, but and I remember people talking about seeing Kurt Russell around at restaurants and stuff, but it was huge news at the time. But there were a few Kentucky movies around this time, because Seabiscuit, which was a few years prior, I think, another horse movie, was also filmed around here, which I think the success of Seabiscuit, I think, probably major contributing factor to both of these movies being greenlit. I remember my elementary school, or it might have been middle school at that point, like, showed Dreamer like on DVD when it was first new, so it must have been a promo copy or something that they had somehow gotten, because it was still in theaters at that point, I'm pretty sure, but they showed it like in the gym and we all went down and watched it. Racing Stripes, because it wasn't filmed here, I feel like wasn't treated with nearly as much of a fanfare, but I did go see it in theaters with one of the few movies I went to see in theaters with my grandpa, which I'm just laughing thinking about, like, an old man having to sit through this movie. Like, but I do remember it's one of the first movies afterwards. I was like, "Oh, what do you think, Papa?" And he said, "Well, to be honest, it was thoroughly mediocre." I think I have to agree with him there.
Hey, you a small horse or some sort of an ass? 'Cause you look like an ass to me.
Look, I don't mean to be rude, but you seem to be a little more surf than turf. Did you take a wrong turn?
All right, because you look a little slow, I'll skip the salad and get right to the risotto.
All right, so it's time we're going to do 2 sets of slime scores. The way it's going to work is we're going to give all the slime scores for one movie, and then all the slime scores for the other movie. And we're going to start with Dreamer.
First off, this was a very fun exercise. I think this was a very clear-cut example of one movie being a very Slimehouse movie, one being a very not Slimehouse movie. Dreamer, of course, being that not Slimehouse film, and just a very classic, almost textbook version of kind of your inspirational horse movie, inspirational underdog movie. To me, there was nothing slimy about it whatsoever, and so for that, I give it the first one I've given on this show.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think this movie was just a very straightforward, sort of inspirational, aiming to be just a timeless family tale of an inspirational horse story. It just felt more just like a prestige movie in the vein of Seabiscuit or something like that than anything even close to Slime, despite the fact that, as we mentioned, there were a few slimy character tropes. The dynamic between a daughter and a father and a sort of... that felt sort of slimy, and it is focused on a child character, which of course we always talk about, but I agree with Jasper. I think it's a 1, not a slimy movie at all to me.
I'm going to third this motion and also give it a 1, and primarily for those tonal reasons that I mentioned earlier, but I don't need to reiterate everything. It's a 1.
My first one was Bill and Ted 3 when we did the 2020 recap, and that's like my base reference for a 1, honestly, and this isn't that. I'm going to go for a 2 simply because I do think, like...
What?
Okay, Luis Guzman's presence, I think, is something... It's a 1.5, but, like...
Let him do his thing.
No, sorry, I'm just genuinely shocked. Please.
Like, I do think some of the supporting, like, the jockey and the staff characters are, like... I do think there's some comic relief in this, like, more than, like, we're making it seem like there is. And I think there's it is like a story about a a young kid going against these adults in their world, and I think that is a fantasy in of itself too. And then also like those little gags I was talking about with the coffee and the popsicles and all that. Like, I don't know, like for something to be a 1 on the slime score scale for me, it has to be like something we watched by accident, and this is not something we watched by accident.
Interesting.
So,
I mean, that's all. I think those are all really sound reasons, to be honest. Especially it being kind of like a child's, kind of fantasy movie.
like I am very, very judicious with the ones I give, and I just don't think Dreamer is quite that. Like, it's close, but like,
Dang, I'm genuinely am sort of surprised, but I'm not. Your points are totally valid, and it makes me curious what a Jared 1 will become if not Dreamer.
On that note, what's a Jared Racing Stripes score?
So a couple weeks ago I gave Snow Dogs a little bit lower. I lowballed that compared to you guys and gave that a 6. And now watching Racing Stripes, I kind of regret that and feel like that was more of a 7, and I think this is also a 7. Like, I think I've just kind of recalibrated what a 7 out of 10 slime score is, and I think Snow Dogs and Racing Stripes are that, for a lot of the same reasons. The way that the animal humor is employed or deployed, and the cast, and the kind of bland early 2000s vibe of the production. I think that all kind of comes together. There's no like, the style and the gags in this aren't such they're like, oh my gosh, this is so, like, except for like the snot one and like the bird excrement. Like, it's a movie that I don't think is too like over the top compared to Prime Slime, but it certainly is part of the canon. So I'm gonna go with a 7.
I'll echo that exact sentiment. This is a 7 for me, and the big thing that makes it not higher is that a lot of the movie is dedicated to Hayden Panettiere and her dad and the conflict there, which is not a very Slimehouse dynamic, really. I mean, yes, it's a single parent, but the tone of that doesn't feel that Slimehouse. And so it's contrast with the flies and the pelican shit and all that that's super Slimehouse. So, but so much of the movie is not that it's not enough to be higher. And yes, the spirit is very kind of Hollywood, not like anarchy. So solid 7 for me.
I think I'll go 1 higher. I think this is an 8 for me. I agree with most of what you all have said already. It is focused a lot on the human characters, and just sort of the way the story works itself out is not particularly slimy at all. It's more rooted in something like Dreamer or an inspirational movie. But I think that just the animal characters are so center stage compared to the humans. Even if the humans do have a lot of screen time, the story never feels like it's as much their story as it is Stripes' story. And just the presence of those flies, I think, are some of the slimiest characters we've seen in any movie we've watched. Just how they exist solely to just do gross out humor and like topical pop culture humor. And I think just the presence of them, and to a lesser extent, but still definitely there, the gangster pelican, I think sort of takes it over the edge to an 8 for me, just because even if it's not completely animal based, the animal humor when it's there is very slimy. So I'd give it an 8.
Yeah, I'm gonna echo Max. I also give it an 8. And this movie actually surprised me in how slimy it really was. When we kind of initially chose this, I had never seen this movie, and I kind of assumed it was along the lines of Babe, which we talked about, where there was talking animals, but the humor was a little less gross out, a little less scatological, a little less kind of rooted in contemporary pop culture. But overall, I got kind of the same feeling I did with Snow Dogs, which we just talked about with this movie, kind of what Jared was just saying. It's kind of half underdog, feel-good sports movie, and then half of it's just this loony bin, crazy Slimehouse comedy. So yeah, I land on an 8.
Well, that concludes our very first slime study. If you like this, let us know, because we'll try to brainstorm some others. I think for me personally, the next slime study I want to do is I want to do more of like a comedy that's not Slimehouse, because I think distinguishing what types of humor is not Slimehouse but still maybe family would be interesting. But I don't have an example yet, so also let us know if you have examples that could be potential slime studies.
And until next week, stay slimy, y'all.
Slimehouse, a podcast created by Jared Anderson, Jasper Birnbaum, Max Morris, and H. Nelson Tracy. If you like this episode, you can find more fun on slimehousepod.com. Our website is created by Brian Hume of Valencia Creative Company. Our theme music composed by Greta Russell. Support this podcast at anchor.fm/slimehousepod or by following us on social media at slimehousepod on all platforms.